So what happened was we're talking about a scenario where three people were walking. The first guy trips, second guy trips over the first guy, and the third guy trips over the second guy. Each one of them is chayev for the next guy. And it appears the reason is because either because niskal pashehu, tripping, is guilty, or because each of them had a chance to get up. And we started off yesterday, the Gemara makes a distinction between the first person and the second two. The first person is chayev for himself for not getting up, and for his vessels. If he was carrying things and they broke, and he didn't clean that up too, he's chayev on all of them. And the way we explained yesterday was because niskal pashehu. So effectively, what he did was he did two things. First of all, he himself is on the floor. That is considered adam by not getting up. He's basically an adam hamazik. So let's explain this a little bit more because this will be relevant in another minute. Okay, we're saying a person on the floor is an adam hamazik. Now this itself is, I guess, open to question or different interpretations. You have a guy on the floor. Is he a bor or is he an adam hamazik? Because he should have gotten up. Should have gotten up is usually an argument that's used in conjunction with bor, with a pit. One of the arguments, why are you chayev on a pit in the first place? Because you shouldn't have dug it, or you should have. If you did dig it, you're responsible for watching it. And obviously, one of the big questions we're going to have is there's a debate we had before between Rav and Shmuel. Shmuel says that any stumbling block is a bor. And Rav said, no. A stumbling block is only a bor if it's hefker, if it's ownerless. If you own it, then that's considered a shor. So yeah, like we said, it's an inanimate shor, right? It's your knife in public is like your ox. What's the difference, of course? Whether or not you be chayiv if it broke vessels. Bor is exempt from paying for vessels, or the death of a human being. Okay. Now we have a person on the floor. He's chayiv either because he's a bor or because he's himself, and it's an adam hamazik. Adam hamazik, remember, is chayiv 5 things, right? But not quite, because boishis you're only chayiv with intention, and the other 4, 3 of the remaining 4, you'd only be liable if you had intention to do damage. Boishis you'd need intention to inflict harm. Again, let me just clarify that again. You'd only pay for embarrassment if you had intention to inflict harm. You'd only pay the other 4 payments, 3 of the 4 payments, if you were negligent. If you're not negligent, there's no payments. Okay. So now we're saying as follows: when the first guy who trips, he should have picked himself up. He shouldn't have allowed his vessels to trip. He's chayev whether he does damage or his vessels do damage. The second guy, on the other hand, who trips, he should have gotten up, but it's not necessarily his fault for tripping in the first place, and therefore his vessels are not liable. If let's say he's carrying a barrel, that barrel cracks, and now there's honey or molasses everywhere. You ever heard that story in Boston with the molasses tank that cracked? It's a famous story. It was in Boston, it was in Baltimore. The early 1900s, there was a massive tank of molasses. Enormous tank. And you're talking about the whole thing collapsed. There was molasses everywhere in the street. Yeah. A bunch of people were killed. There's like 20 people, I think, were killed. Yeah.
You can't run away.
Yeah.
Sticky situation.
Brown, sticky stuff. Yeah. And yeah, very big tragedy. And this was like this was like a prepared disaster. Kids, it used to always leak. Kids used to hang around the tank and lick the sides. Anyway, so basically the second guy's carrying molasses on his shoulder, and the whole thing cracks, and the molasses does damage. So that he's exempt for the damage that the molasses causes. And that's because he should have stood up, but he's not liable directly for falling. And the same thing is true with the third guy. He's chayav for himself, but not for his vessels. Okay. Meisvei. So our third line on 21b, and that'll be the 4th line in a second. 31b.
third line from the top.
Now fourth line really. Meisvei Kulon is the fourth line. First one, the fourth line. Kulon chayav al niski gufan. All three scenarios are chayav for themselves, for their own bodies, doing further damage. Upeturi al niski memainin, but they're exempt on the damage of their vessels. Mylav, what does this mean? Presumably means afilu rishon. Even the first guy, meaning even the first person to trip, he's also exempt for the damage caused by his by his vessels. So the Gemara says no, labar mirushin. It means everyone except for the first guy. The first guy is chayev both for himself if he trips somebody or his vessels trip somebody, but everybody else is only exempt if they is only chayev if they trip somebody, not if their vessels trip somebody. Okay, and again, like you pointed out, the vessels here are what we call are a pit that's ownerless that they did not dig. What does that mean? The pit is ownerless. Why? Because presumably their shattered vessels are shattered and not salvageable, so they're ownerless. And they didn't dig it because their tripping was not necessarily their fault. Because they're tripping somebody else, their tripping wasn't their fault. Therefore, the pit was sort of dug on its own and it's ownerless. Okay. 1 second.
First one,
The first guy is guilty for tripping, but he's also guilty for tripping everybody else, which is not considered their fault. Amar Vada Barava. So Vada Barava says, sorry, the Gemara asks about Kulan Katani, the Bryce says everybody. Amar Vada Barava, Kulan Hanazakin. All those that were damaged, meaning person number 2 and 3. So Gemara says, Hi Mai, what exactly does that mean? If you're telling me it includes the first guy, then it's appropriate to say everyone. But if you say it's everybody except for the first guy, my kulan, listening hanazakin. Why does the Bryce say everybody? It should say just those that were damaged. The nizakin, those that were damaged are chayav just for their own bodies, but not for their vessels. Amarava says Rishon chayav ben beniske gufa deshani ben beniske memani deshani. I'm sorry, ben beniske gufa deshani ben beniske memani deshani. The first guy is chayav for both his own body and his vessels damaging the second guy. So the first guy's shattered vessels are considered a stumbling block, a bar for the second guy. 1 second. Now, if the second guy trips over the first guy's body, that's Adam Amazik, and therefore the first guy's chayiv not only on their bodies but also on their vessels, because Adam Amazik is chayiv on vessels. If you break a table, you're chayav to pay. So if Reuven trips and Shimon trips over Reuven carrying a table and the table breaks, that's also Adam Amazik. Okay. The sheni chayav b'niske shlishi b'niske gufa avloi b'niske memayne. Okay, but the second guy is considered a bor, and therefore he's only liable on the third guy, but not on the third guy's table. 1 second. Okay. 1 second. My time, what's the reason? The Havale Bor. Okay, so very interesting. So Rav here is saying the second guy is not Adam HaMazik. The second guy who trips, he's considered a bar. Him, the person, is considered a bar. So it's interesting. This makes a lot of sense according to Shmuel. The Amar Kolta Kol Barhu. Any type of stumbling block is a bar. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So you can argue that the second guy is a bar. Okay, now why is the second guy a bar? Because he should have gotten up. The fact that he tripped, it's not his fault. But now he is a stumbling block, and he should get up and move out of the way. The fact that he doesn't get up, that makes him chayav because of bar. El Rav the Amar, but according to Rav's own opinion, the Amar Afkar ini loy loy, that a bar exists only if it's ownerless. If you own the bar, it's not a bar. That's a shar. So therefore, if a guy is sitting there prone on the sidewalk or in the street, ready to trip over every person that walks by, that guy is not a bar, because bar has to be ownerless, and effectively you own yourself, or at least you're responsible for yourself, even if you don't own yourself. So how could he be a bar? he obviously is an Adam Amazik. If he's an Adam Amazik, he should be chayav for Kalim, for vessels broken. So the second guy should be liable for the third guy's broken table. So the Gemara says, "L'adam k'damar mikara." You're right. You have to go back to the first answer. There's a difference between the first guy and the second two. 1 second. So the Gemara says, "L'adam k'damar mikara." You have to go back to the original answer. What's the original answer? The first guy is chayev for the damages both to the second guy's body and vessels. 1 second. Sorry. First guy is chayev both for himself as a bar and for his vessels. For himself is not a bar, himself is Adam Amazik, but also his vessels he created a bar by tripping. And everybody else is only chayev for themselves, their bodies, but not for the vessels that are shattered in the streets. Okay. And so why does the Bryce say everybody if we're only referring to the second and third guy? Okay, so what we're talking about here is vessels, damaged vessels. So let's explain this. Basically, what happened was the first guy who trips, right? He trips, he's carrying the barrel of molasses. So he's chayev, and the barrel of molasses shatters and breaks. So now there's brown stuff everywhere. Okay, now you have the second guy comes along carrying a table, and sure enough, the molasses is sticky and it's just terrible. And he trips in the molasses and he falls and he's all brown and sticky and his table's broken. Okay, so what did he trip on? He tripped on the molasses, not on the person. Molasses is a bar. The first guy is guilty for digging the bar because he should not have tripped carrying a barrel of molasses. So the first guy trips on the barrel of molasses. He himself, as a prone man on the floor, is going to be an Adam Amazik. Anyone who falls on top of him, he's going to be chayav for, including vessels. But the second guy, but the barrel of molasses is a bar. A bar is exempt from damaging vessels. So when the second guy comes along and he trips on the molasses, what happens? And he breaks his table that he's carrying. So what's the halacha? So on the person that gets damaged, right? He's sticky and he's broke a bone or whatever. He's chayav. All the vessels is exempt from. So now we can understand the Bryce. The Bryce says in all the scenarios, you're chayav on the body, but exempt from the vessels. This is the scenario. Meaning we're referring to the vessels of the first guy, the barrel of molasses that shattered. And now the sticky stuff is everywhere. Right? And chayiv on the guf, he's chayiv on the broken bone of the second guy carrying the table, but he's exempt on the table. Because the table is niska kelim bebar. It's no different than if the table fell into a pit. Together? Okay, a lot quicker than it took me to get this. It took me a lot longer to figure that one out.
The first one is liable for tripping and he's liable for.
So he's liable for two things. He's
the vessel.
Because he's liable for tripping.
Right,
therefore, again, repeat yourself.
Okay.
Sorry.
The first person who falls does not create a bore.
He does.
Oh, he creates it.
His shattered molasses is the bar.
Is the bore.
And that's because he's guilty for tripping.
Okay.
So therefore, now the barrel of molasses is in all likeliness ownerless because I don't know how much of it's salvageable. Probably nothing.
Oh, okay.
So if it's not salvageable, then effectively he doesn't really care about it anymore. He makes it ownerless. If you had a barrel of molasses, would you think of keeping it? Probably not, right? So, but because he's guilty for digging it, because he's guilty for tripping, so he's responsible till it gets cleaned up.
Okay.
Then he's also responsible on his own prone body lying in the middle of the street.
Right.
Okay.
So this
Okay.
would
It's all easier from here.
Yeah, so the same would apply if you tripped onto the shards of the barrel.
Again, yeah, for sure. No difference whether they tripped over molasses or the shards. It's the same.
Yeah.
If he's carrying glass instead of molasses, that'll be effective. It's no different.
Yeah.
Okay. Amar Mar. So 5 lines before the Mishnah on 31b. From here on, it's all much easier. Okay. Okay, so the Mishnah says if all three people fell because of the first guy, then the first guy is chayav for everything. So the Gemara wants to know exactly how did that happen. How did that happen? One possibility is where he was so I guess it must have been a small pathway, and he fell and he was blocking the whole pathway. People need to get by, so they sort of walked over him, they tripped and they fell. It's his fault for everybody. Like the stick of a blind man. So right, so typically people that can't see, they walk with very long sticks.
Right.
I'm curious, let me borrow this for a second. I think what it means is that sort of is like a super duper tripping agent, right? This massively long stick, you can just trip everybody at once. So yeah, basically the same thing. So basically the guy was laying flat across the road, tripping everybody. He's responsible for all the damage that happened. Says the Mishnah, we saw this mission previously. Like one guy comes with a barrel, the other guy comes with a beam, right? So who's first? The guy So the guy with the beam is walking first, right? And the beam is parallel to his direction of travel. The guy with the barrel crashes right into the beam. What's the story with the owner? The guy with the beam, is he chayav or not? He's exempt. Potter. They're both permitted to walk. The guy carrying the beam is first. The guy with the barrel is second. The guy with the barrel walks into the guy with the guy carrying the beam. Potter. The guy carrying the beam is exempt because he was walking and the other guy was walking. There's nothing wrong. Potter balkaira. The imam balkaira. Let's say the guy with the beam stopped walking. Chayav. So then he's chayav if the guy with the barrel crashes into him. But if he tells the people behind him to stop because he's stopping, so then Potter, he's exempt. What about the opposite? The guy carrying the barrels walking first, and the guy carrying the beam is second. Right? So the guy with the beam crashes into the guy with the barrel. The halacha is he's chayav. Vim Omer Balchav Potter. But if the guy carrying the barrel stops suddenly, and then the guy with the beam crashes into him from behind, with the call in English a fender bender, right? Potter, the guy carrying the beam is exempt. Let's say the guy carrying the barrel in front said to the person behind him, stop. So then chayev. And the guy behind him crashes into him is chayev. And this is true not just with barrels and beams, but it's also true of one guy's carrying a torch and the other guy's carrying flax. You can imagine it's not a pretty combination. It actually is pretty, but it does a lot of damage.
Rabbi, what about reasonable stopping distance?
Let's talk about it now. The presumption here is you have no business stopping in a thoroughfare. There's no traffic light system. Thoroughfare is for walking and traveling. If you want to stop, move to the side of the road. There's a shoulder for a reason. It's not that different from a guy who sort of stops in the middle of the highway. Where there's a certain amount of culpability there. You don't belong stopping. If you need to pull over, there's a shoulder for a reason. If there's an emergency, then it's dangerous. No sane person stops in the stops in the middle of the highway. Even the shoulder is considered very dangerous. People die on the shoulder all the time. So yeah, that's basically the idea. If you're stopping in the middle of a road, the guy is permitted to walk. So you're sort of guilty whatever happens to you, whether you're carrying a beam and somebody crashes. What's interesting here is the scenarios of right, typically in a car crash, the guy in the back is usually responsible. Like, I don't know, 90% of the time or 80%, whatever it is. But over here, it doesn't make a difference. The Mishnah is pointing out that the scenarios are the opposite. So the damager could either be in front or in back. It could be I crashed into the damage or the damager crashed into me. Me meaning being the guy carrying the barrel. And in another scenario, I'd have to pay. I'm sorry, the guy who did not have a right to stop would be liable. Okay. Rabba Barnosim or Rafuna. So Rabba Barnosim had the following question for Rafuna. Hamazikas ishta b'shtashin shamita. Okay, interesting scenario. A guy damaged his wife during intercourse. Mahu, what's the story? Kivin the Rishuska Avid Potter. Idilma iboyle le'yune. Do we say, since this is sort of consensual, so then he's exempt? Idilma, do we say iboyle le'yune, he should have been more careful? Amar Leis, he says to Nisu, we learned it in our Mishnah, if both people have permission to walk down the street, and they crash into each other, the damager is exempt. The cause of the damage is exempt. So same thing should be true if a guy who causes damage to his wife during consensual intimacy. So Rava says Kavachimer miyar. Kavachimer. Rava says a little bit different. Umayar. Okay, so what's yar? Yar is a forest. The instance of the forest is referring to somebody who was chopping down woods and it killed somebody accidentally, and he goes into exile. Okay, so let's compare it to yar, a forest. Umayar shezela reshu senichnas, zela reshu senichnas. Each one of them came into the forest with permission. It's a forest; everyone's allowed to come in. And nasa can be shenichnas to reshus chaveroi v'chayev. It's as if he went to the domain of his friend, v'chayev, and if he kills him by mistake, he's liable. Zelo shel reshus chaveroi nichnas lekol shkin. So basically in a forest, each one of them come on their own, and it's as if it's as if the aggressor, the guy who's chopping down wood, enters the domain of the victim, the guy who's walking in the forest, and if he kills him, he goes into exile. Similarly, with regard to this guy damaging his wife in intercourse, over here where he clearly enters somebody else's domain, like certainly it should be the case that the man should be chayiv for the damage accrued to his wife. So Gemara says, okay, fine, but Ella, what do you do with the Mishnah? The Mishnah says clearly that if they both have permission to be there in the public area and they both damage each other, then they're exempt from damages. So Gemara says, there's a difference. In the public, they both are equally entitled to walk in the public area. However, a man with a woman, in the case of intercourse, the man engages in the action of intercourse, the woman does not. And therefore, it's considered as if the man is engaging with permission in the woman's property. Therefore, he would be chayev, he would be liable for damage that accrues to the woman. Because it's his action and it's her domain. The Gemara says, clearly the woman is penalized for engaging in a prohibited act of intercourse. What does that tell me? Obviously, she is an active participant as well. So the Gemara says, no, it's possible for her still to be liable for engaging in prohibited intercourse without it being considered her action. And why is that the case? Because they both derive pleasure from this action, therefore they're both liable. But the action is considered exclusively in the domain of the male, not the female, and therefore he would be liable for damage that accrues to his wife. Okay, Hayabal Kaira Rishon. The guy carrying the beam was first. Amr Shlakish says, the Gemara is going to bring a law of Rish Lakish. This law we've seen many times before, and the Gemara is going to try to equate it to the Mishnah. And we'll see that even though it's quite similar, it's actually not. Amr Shlakish. Rish Lakish says, you have shtei paras b'shusarabim, 2 oxen in public. Achas revutza v'achas malachas. One is lying, one is walking. Bata malachas b'revutza. The walking one kicks the lying one. P'tura, it's exempt. Revutza b'malachas, but if the lying animal kicks the animal walking, chayeves, it's liable. Okay, sounds like our Mishnah. Why? Because an animal has no permission to lie down in a public area. So let's try to prove what he's saying from our Mishnah. The guy carrying the beam is first. The guy with the barrel walks into the beam. The guy who owns the beam is exempt. But if he stops suddenly, chayev, because he had no business stopping. Over here, it's as if the guy with the beam is considered the animal lying down on the floor, and it kicks the guy carrying the barrel, the guy who's walking, or the animal who's walking. Uktani chayev, and we see that you're liable. Sounds similar?
Mhm.
The Gemara says v'tizbar, is this logical? Ha-saya baya, you're trying to bring a proof. Not only is not only is your proof so invalid, fundamentally it's actually a question. It's actually the opposite. The Mishnah is the opposite of Rish Lakish. Why is it the opposite? What's the question? Time of debata. Potter. The implication of Rish Lakish is that if the animal lying kicks the animal walking, then the lying animal is liable. What happens if the walking animal trips over the lying animal? Then the lying animal would be exempt from damages. 1 second, but from our Mishnah, we see the opposite. In our Mishnah, we see that if the guy carrying the beam stops suddenly, he's liable for stopping, which is the opposite of Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish talks about an active event, they kick. That means that Rish Lakish presumes that in a passive event, the animal lying on the floor is exempt. But our Mishnah talks about a passive event, the guy carrying the beam who stops, and he is liable. It's actually the opposite of Rish Lakish. Together?
Mhm.
Yeah?
Sure.
But Masnisim de Memelo, our Mishnah is passive. The guy who stops is passive damage, or Ptani Chayev. It says you're liable. The implication of Rish Lakish is that a passive damage would be exempt. So the Gemara says, Masnisim de Pascal Orcha Kashalda. Our Mishnah is referring to the guy with the beam. He's sort of blocking the entire way. So it's impossible for the guy with the barrel to walk through without breaking it. And that's why he's liable for the breaking of the barrel. However, in the scenario of Rish Lakish, the animal was lying on one side of the road, still in the road, but on the side of it. The animal could have realized and walked around it. The animal was not forced to cross over. And that's why you're exempt. That's why the lying animal is exempt from passive damage that accrues to the walking animal. Okay, so the Gemara says, I'll say for the Masnisim Messiah Rish Lakish. The Gemara says, okay, the end of the Mishnah maybe supports Rish Lakish. The guy with the barrel is first, and the guy with the beam is second. And the guy Nishbur Chavis Bekara, the guy with the barrel, the guy with the beam walks into the guy with the barrel. In this case, the barrel is first. So the beam walks into the barrel. 1 second. Nishbur Chavis Bekara. Okay, the beam walks into the barrel. Chayev, reliable. Potter. However, if the guy with the barrel stops suddenly, then the damager, meaning the guy with the beam, is exempt. Over here, it's like the walking animal kicks the lying animal, and Uktani Potter, and Rish Lakish says Potter, and the Mishnah says Potter. So this appears to support the opinion of Rish Lakish, right? You have the aggressor animal in the back. It aggresses the animal or the barrel that stopped, and it's exempt. So basically, it seems that they're saying the same thing. The Gemara says not quite. The Mishnah is talking about casual damage. In other words, the guy with the beam is sort of walking along his way, and he happens to crashes into a barrel. However, Hacham, the scenario of Rish Lakish, Amarlei, the animal lying on the floor, he has a different argument. He says, Rish Lakish's idea carries with it a significant implication. We're not talking here where the walking animal tramples the lying animal. That would be identical to the Mishnah. We're talking about here where the walking animal kicks the lying animal. So, where there would be an argument that the owner of the lying animal could say, listen, you have a right to walk, you don't have a right to kick. So you should be chayev, which is different than our Mishnah. And yet Rish Lakish still says you're potter. So the Mishnah clearly does not support the opinion of Rish Lakish. Okay. Two people are walking in public. One guy is running, one guy's walking. Or they're both walking. They There's an impact. They cause each other damage. Turin, they're exempt from payments. Or either or. Either one was walking, one was running, or they both were running, and they sort of bumped into each other. They're exempt from damage. Okay. Masnisen, my brother was in camp this summer. He was playing a game of football, and somebody threw the ball high. They're both running for it, two people, and neither of them saw each other. Yeah, it wasn't pleasant. Masnisen, but it's just a scenario. They're both exempt. They're both playing a game of football. They're both running. They're both allowed to run. It's unfortunate, but that's the story. Masnisen, the Loike Isi ben Yehudah. This mission is not like Isi ben Yehudah. The Tanya we learned, Isi ben Yehudah Aimer, Rotz Chayev Neshu Mishona. The guy running, he's liable. Why? Because it's unusual. You shouldn't be running in public. However, Isi will agree that Erev Shabbos, as the sun's coming down, you are allowed to run because sort of it's understandable. Amar of Yechanan. Halacha, having said that, I was in a very Haredi neighborhood in Yerushalayim.
What kind of neighborhood?
Very Haredi, very religious neighborhood, and I saw way too many accidents that happened Friday afternoon right before Shabbos. Way too many. Like, and the guy just often what happens is the guy just leaves his car there, so it's just there all Shabbos, broken on the side of the road.
Oh.
Hopefully, all he did was crash into a pole or something, but I don't know. Anyway, yeah, I've seen quite a few of these wrecks, Erev Shabbos wrecks. So Rav Yechanan says, Halacha Isi ben Yehudah, the Halacha follows Isi ben Yehudah, you're allowed to run Erev Shabbos right before the time comes. So the Gemara says, Rav Yechanan say this? But Rav Yechanan Halacha Kastam Mishnah. Rav Yechanan says the Halacha follows a typical Mishnah of unnamed authorship, like our Mishnah. Our Mishnah seems to contradict Isi ben Yehudah. But our Mishnah says, Echad Rotz, Echad Mahalach, Ashneim Rotz, and Peturin. Our Mishnah says very clearly that a guy who's running you're allowed to run in public, basically. A guy who's running, you crash into a guy who's walking, the guy who's running is exempt. So the Gemara says, Masnisin ve'erev Shabbos bein hashmoshes. The Mishnah is referring to somebody who's allowed to run because it's erev Shabbos right before Shabbos is coming in. So the Gemara says, how do we know this? If they were both running, you're exempt. So the Gemara says, Hasul Amali. In other words, if one guy is running, one guy's walking. So there'd be a reason to think, in other words, one guy's engaging in sort of regular behavior, the other guy's engaging in unusual behavior. And in that case, they're both exempt. Surely if they're both running, they're both exempt. In other words, the first scenario of the mission is as follows: one's running, one's walking. And when did that story happen? On Erev Shabbos. On Erev Shabbos, right before Shabbos. So therefore, they're both exempt because the guy who's running is allowed to run. But normally speaking, they'd both be liable, except if they were both running. So then they were both doing something unusual. So then they're both exempt. If they're both running, I feel b'chol. If they're both running, even during the weekday, they'll both be exempt. Amar we learned. Isi says that in Erev Shabbos, before Shabbos, right before Shabbos, they're both running with permission. What type of permission is granted? Like the opinion of Rav Chanina. Bayu v'neitze likras kala malkasa. The Amri likras Shabbos kala malkasa. This is the idea that one should go out on Erev Shabbos and greet the Shabbos. About 1,500 years later, this was modernized by the Arizal. Kabbalistically, this is sort of the prayer that we do, which we call Kabbalah Shabbos. Because it's a, relatively speaking, modern prayer. It's only 600 years, 500 years old. That's why we do it by the bima, not by the Yomers. Sort of make that distinction to point that it's sort of a modern custom. Now, it's based on an ancient custom. The ancient custom is to do something to greet the Shabbos. There was always a custom to go out and greet Shabbos. And that custom acquired a formal tradition, which what we call today as Kabbalah Shabbos, about 500 years ago. Okay, and that's why some say, if you look in the Siddur, you'll see some say Boy v'neitz likers kal malchus or likers Shabbos kal malchus. Okay, Rabbi Yanai is atif ikoy v'amar boy chala boy chala. Rabbi Yanai would wear a talis, and he would say boy chala, which is part of one of the prayers that we say, right? L'chadaydi. Okay. Anyway, the point Rav Chanina is trying to bring out is that a person sort of is running out of Shabbos to greet the Shabbos. There was such a custom. A guy is chopping wood in a public area, and I don't know exactly what happened, but sort of it did damage in a private area. Either the wood flew or the hatchet flew, something like that, or the opposite. Was chopping wood in his backyard, but it damaged somebody walking in public. He was chopping wood in private, but it damaged somebody in another private property, not his own. Chayev, he's liable. Says the Gemara, it's necessary to say all these instances. If we would have been speaking about somebody who is chopping wood in private and he does damage in public, that's because he should have been careful because he was chopping wood next to a public area. But if he was doing it in a public area, chopping wood, and there happens to be a private area nearby, he wasn't sure. Maybe there were people there, maybe not, but certainly not as many people as public. As in a public area, maybe he'd be exempt because he doesn't realize that people are in that private area. And if the Brisa would have said from a public area to a private area, 1 second. Sorry. If it would have just said the scenario of public to private, if we would have said just the scenario, the guy chopping wood in public and it does damage in private, I would say that scenario is chayev because he had no business chopping wood in public. It's not his, he doesn't have a right to chop wood there. But the opposite, where he does have permission to chop, he's in his own private property, even if it's next to a public area, maybe because he has a right to chop wood there, he should be exempt. I would say that each of these two scenarios have their own weak factor. There's something wrong going on. The guy who's chopping in public had no right to chop in public. The guy who's chopping in private should have realized there's a public area next door. So they both did something wrong. But if there are two private areas next to each other, where number one, there aren't a lot of people around, and his neighbor isn't often around, and number two, he's allowed to chop there. Maybe he'd be exempt. Therefore, it's necessary, and the mission has every scenario. Okay, stop here. Okay, great day.